I grew up in the 1970s, so as a kid, I remember watching a lot of war films. As a kid, there was only like two or three TV channels, so and the controlled media, that's what they used to show, often during the daytime at the weekends. So as a kid, I watched them all: The Great Escape, Dam Busters, 633 Squadron, all of them. Often my dad was there at the same time. So um, basically in those movies they sort of portrayed Germans as being obedient rule followers who were prone to fall for authoritarianism. They kind of had a natural affinity, let's say, with authoritarianism. And for us Brits, we weren't like that. We were more free thinking individuals, whereas the Germans were more sort of collectivist, lovers of authoritarianism. Tell me what to do and I'll do it. And as Brits in the 70s, we thought that that was hilarious that Germans were like that. And us freedom loving Brits weren't like that. And we were better than them because of that. So the purpose of this video, and I've been thinking about doing it for a while, is that illusion of Germans being more prone to falling for authoritarianism than us was shattered in the winter of 2021. Why do I say that? Well, basically, around about the same time, the German and the Austrian governments announced that they passed a new law, and the law basically said it's illegal to refuse the life-saving medical treatment. And if you refused it, then in the first instance you would get fined, and then if you refused to pay the fine, the German and the Austrian governments promised that they would imprison the people that rejected the life-saving medical treatment. Now, that was about, as it turned out, I actually did a video about this because when they made that announcement, I just thought, well, that's their last card that they can play. There's no more cards that they can play after that. That's about as harsh as the coercion can get. So at the time I felt, well, they've played their last card, and you don't play your last card unless you're absolutely desperate and you know that you're losing. So for me, I was actually quite optimistic when that announcement was made because it just smacked of desperation. Anyway, what was really, really interesting was I think in Austria, I remember 30% of the population, which is quite a big number, had not even been to see Britney and the Boosters once, and that 30% remained unchanged. They weren't intimidated by this coercion from their own government that they had to have it or face fines or the threat of going to prison. And also, the German government was forced into abandoning this policy because the German people themselves called the government's bluff. So, what does this show? It shows that actually those World War II films were actually wrong. There was a hardcore of Germans. They were tested, and they actually passed that test. And I believe that those Germans and Austrians actually did us a massive favour in that they were probably using Germany and Austria as a test bed. If the Germans and Austrians had caved, then maybe the French government would have been the next to follow, then the British government, etc. But they held the line, and they stopped this particular aspect of the tyranny in its tracks. So rather than Germans being inclined towards authoritarianism, they were the heroes in the piece. I know there'll be some Brits who'll say, well, what about the NHS 100,000? So these were also doctors and nurses that were threatened with losing their jobs because they had rejected the life-saving medical treatment. And yeah, these people did well. The one thing that I would add to that, though, is that there's an awful lot. I think the NHS employs over 1 million people, so it's about 10% maybe of the staff that rejected it. But it's interesting as well, though. Those probably were the frontline staff, because I remember the demonstration in London. They were all throwing down their blue NHS overalls because they said that they weren't going to be intimidated and coerced with this mandate, that they had to have it in order to keep their jobs. The other thing that I would say about them, though, is that 100,000 in some ways is a lot of people. That's 100,000 potential whistleblowers. So why haven't these people spoken up? It's an interesting one, isn't it? They should have been speaking up more vocally about what they'd seen. You know, the damage caused by the Britney Spears and the boosters. But you know, basically, what you could say is that once the threat to their job had gone, they sort of jumped back in line again. And I don't know how many of those people have still been giving other people, the Britney Spears and the boosters, the same thing that they were prepared to lose their job over, you know, over rejecting it. So yeah, that's what I want to say today, is that as guess, summing it all up, is that we're defined by our actions. Talk is cheap, especially if you're talking or writing anonymously online on a web forum or on Twitter, or so. Anyone can do that. It requires no guts, no courage. For me, I take my hat off to those Austrians and Germans who called their government's bluff. And you know, I think when it comes down to it, there's probably not a lot of difference between the 21st century Brit and the 21st century German. Maybe the Brits are even more inclined towards authoritarianism than the Germans are. But yeah, so that's all I want to say. One last thing as well, I suppose, is you can't if you've been taking part in the Britney Spears and the Boosters program, if you took paid employment to put signage up in shops telling people that they had to wear their underpants on their face to gain entry, there's no way that you can complain about what's gone on, because you actually made that tyranny happen. You know, if you think about Klaus Schwab and Jill Bates and co, all they have is their mouth. You know, they make announcements. The actual tyranny comes from the low level enablers who put Klaus's words into action in return for money. These are people who have in effect sold their own souls. They've complied with the system and they've tried to make Klaus's dreams into a reality, or you know, Klaus's nightmare into our nightmare. No, I don't mean that. Klaus's dream is our nightmare, but you get the drift. Anyway, that's all I want to say today, so God bless.